it sounds like you all can hear me. Yeah, I usually tell people just call me the diversity lady. That sounds a lot more informal. And it sounds like we can actually have a chat as opposed to sort of something weird and corporate. But so this talk is a slight modification of what we talk about in our unconscious bias training at Atlassian. And I'll just let you know, I will ask you questions, so prepare your answers. I like to have a conversation more than just lecture at you. It's more fun that way. But yeah, so this is one of my sort of personal loves. I think I have the best job in the world. I get to work with people across the company and really across the tech industry to think about how we think about recruiting people and how we make sure that they feel included and that their ideas are really important. So thank you so much to Renee and all of you. I'm really, really excited to be here. So first, I think whenever I talk about diversity, the first question is, what kind of diversity are we talking about? What are we talking about when we say diversity? And the answer to that is something that we call cognitive diversity. So that means diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, and diversity of opinion. It's been shown in tons of empirical research that having a diversity of perspective helps teams solve hard problems better. And that seems kind of obvious, right? More ideas means you're probably going to get a good one. The problem with this theory is that we don't have a good test for cognitive diversity. So we have to use things like identity characteristics to proxy for that. So it's a good bet that someone who's a man and someone who's a woman, or someone who's off the gender binary, has a very different set of life experiences that are going to inform the way that they solve problems. And that's true if you're talking about their race, or where they came from, or what their first language is, or whether they have a disability, or maybe they served in the military, right? So we think of all these really unique pieces of ourselves that inform the way that we solve problems. And so when I'm talking about diversity, that's what I'm talking about. It's all of the unique things that each of us bring to the table, and mixing those together is what's really important and what we're trying to get at. The second thing I want to talk about is we also talk about intersectional identities when we're talking about diversity. So all of those categories that I just mentioned and the 1,000 other ones that I didn't get to, we also want to think about how having multiple of those, right? How does your gender interact with your race and interact with what country you're from? How does that change, right? Being a woman from France is different than being a woman from Oman, which is being different than being a woman from Austin. And those things are really important. So when we talk about diversity in tech, we can often just talk about women, and that's a great start, but knowing that that's the beginning of the conversation. The second thing is why diversity? Why is it important? And the cool thing is that basically all of the empirical evidence we have from economics, from sociology, from psychology, tells us that diversity drives better business outcomes. We're talking about 53% better performance against goals, just baseline revenue. We're talking about 24% greater retention, which is an incredible cost driver and also brain drain for companies. Greater emotional commitment to colleagues. Folks who work in diverse companies report being happier at their jobs, right? All of these things are super important. So basically everything we want to get to, diversity helps us get there. It builds more innovative products. It makes happier employees who want to stay around longer. They care about their colleagues more. But that's not the only reason to do it, right? We all kind of have heard the business case. We've been in tech for a while. And these are the Atlassian values. So these are the things that we live every day. And as I've learned a lot about Indeed, you all also have a really awesome set of values. And for us, these drive our diversity efforts, right? So the middle one, the customer. The idea there is we want to build the best products for our customers. And the way we do that is we understand them. And the way that we understand them is that our employee makeup looks like the people that we're building products for. We have products in 160 countries around the world. We have 50,000 customers. And so the way for us to understand how they work is to work like them and to build things that they love. And that's true for every company that I've ever seen. And for us, we talk about playing as a team. And part of that means simply being open to new experiences and hearing about new perspectives of people that aren't quite like us. So we kind of all agree that diversity is good and it's going to get us at the things we want to get to, right? Then why is it so hard? Why do we not have it in this industry at the level that we think would be better? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, and people talk about structural factors. They talk about the pipeline. But tonight we're going to talk about ourselves. We're going to talk about the way that our brains work if we are not mindful and careful, can actually get in the way of this goal that we all agree on. So sometimes we just get in our own way. But the cool thing is, when you understand the psychology of what's going on, you can actually get out of your own way and help everyone around you do the same thing. So first, bias, right? It's like a big, scary word, and everyone thinks it's terrible, right? Who has a negative association with bias? Yeah? So I'm going to challenge that. And the reason is because bias is deeply connected to something called a heuristic. Anyone ever heard of a heuristic? It's really just a simple model to make a decision. And what bias is, it's an inefficiency in that decision making. So most of the time, heuristics help us do things like cross the street without getting flattened, lock our doors in the morning when we leave the house, make sure we're crossing people on the right side when we're crossing or walking down the street. And so bias is actually just that little inefficiency in the system. It's not terrible all the time, but it is an inefficiency. So thinking about it as a negative thing that we need to feel shameful about isn't helpful, but thinking about it as an opportunity is the right way to go about it. So what is a cognitive bias? Well, my fancy definition is it's just a systemic pattern of deviation from rationality, right? So we like to think that we make perfectly objective decisions, but we're humans and that's not always true, right? Sometimes we have that extra slice of pie after Thanksgiving, even though we know that's not the right choice. And so that's what biases are, right? They're little inefficiencies at the end of our judgment. And what we're going to talk about for the next hour is ways, really easy ways, that you can interrupt those biases, make better decisions. And by making better decisions about people in particular, you can actually help encourage diversity and inclusivity at Indeed or anywhere else that you are. So what is bias? What are heuristics? Does anyone want to guess how many pieces of information we deal with every single minute of every single day? You can just yell it out. 10,000. 10,000? Okay. 11 million. That's a lot of information for your brain to process, right? And so these heuristics and these biases which come out of them, we use heuristics to deal with all of that information. Now, who wants to guess how many pieces of information our conscious mind can process at any 1 minute? 8? Someone said 1. A little higher than that. It's 40. That means that almost 100% of all of the information you've ever received has been processed by your unconscious mind using heuristics. So even if only 0.1% of those decisions have bias in them, that's still a lot of decisions, right? So there's an incredible opportunity to improve and for us to get closer to where we want to get to by understanding what our biases are and how we can interrupt them. So you've probably heard of biases. If you look in Wikipedia, which is the compendium of all human knowledge, the list of cognitive biases lists 171 separate cognitive biases that can affect us at any one time. So I'm just going to really quickly go through a couple. You're probably familiar with a lot of them, you just don't know they have fancy terms for people with PhDs. So confirmation bias, right? We've heard of this. Our brains, just like information that agrees with things that we already know, right? We look for information that confirms our beliefs. Recency bias. We're a lot better at remembering and acting on things that happened really recently. Part of that's just a memory issue, right? But people are probably familiar with this. If you do something really, really great, like 2 months before your performance review, it probably is going to affect it a lot more than if you did it 8 months ago, right? That's not an endorsement to not do anything for 6 months. What about the framing effect? So if we present, experimental subjects are in the real world with information, the information we present around that actually can completely change the way they react to it and the decision they make based on that information. The halo effect. This is something happened to you before and it affects your decision making later. So it turns out there's a really great behavioral economics study that if someone, when they had phone booths, this was back when those were real, if someone found a quarter in a phone booth before someone asked them to sign a petition, they were more likely to sign the petition when they found the quarter than when they didn't, right? Because you're in a good mood, so you're willing to help somebody else out. This also impacts things like judgments on people. So just standing next to someone can actually change the way someone judges you. It's weird. They did this example with people who are overweight. So people who are overweight are judged on average to be less competent than people who are not, even in absence of any evidence showing that. But the effect is not just for that person, it's also for an effect of anyone standing around them, right? It's crazy. So the halo effect, real thing. In-group bias. We just tend to show a preference or give preferential treatment to people that are like ourselves, right? Again, it's like family, right? We like our family better than we like people we don't know. Really simple, but these things affect our decision making, even in the workplace, even where we don't want them to. So the way I think of it is I'm making suboptimal decisions like this. When I'm looking at a candidate, for example, for a job, maybe these are the things that I really care about when I'm evaluating them. I care about their problem-solving ability. I care about the experience that they've had before they walked into that interview room. I care about their values. Maybe I care a little bit about their training, but I don't care whether they went to Harvard or Arizona State or anywhere, because I know that the prestige of their school actually doesn't tell me anything about the potential that they have. But if I don't understand my biases, given that my unconscious brain is running about almost 100% of all my decisions, that might be a little closer to what's driving it, right? So all of the things I care about suddenly have been given less weight, and things that I consciously know don't matter, like someone's gender, like their race. Maybe I'm overweighting their education, right? That's what happens to our decisions. And if for some reason gender is pushing me in the wrong direction, or education is pushing me in the wrong direction, I may make the wrong decision. The reason this is so important to think about when we're talking about people is that all of the models that our brain relies on are inherently simple, and people are inherently complex. So often the models that we're using just fail to accurately describe or even be useful in the situations that we're using them. So what actually affects when we think about race, we think about gender, we think about education? The answer is the simplest model of a person affects us. So a stereotype, there's a great quote that I love by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She says, "Some stereotypes are true, some are false, and all are incomplete," right? So there's positive and negative stereotypes, and even if we don't consciously believe those stereotypes, they exist in our culture. They exist sort of in the ether. And that's important because it means that our unconscious brain has been shown these examples throughout our lives. So things like men are better at engineering than women, right? Women are better at communication and caring for other people than men. This is important because our unconscious brain can hold attitudes that are 180 degrees from what we consciously believe. And those are the things that are driving our decisions. We can also get into much, much less savory stereotypes, but all of those things affect us when we're making decisions. The other thing about bias is it doesn't actually take a lot to have a big effect. I like to say that bias is like putting money in your 401k, but without the exciting vacation home at the end of it. So little tiny bits of bias can compound over time in a system to lead to incredible inequalities, even when no one intentionally got it that way. So something like getting passed over for a promotion one time, or being interrupted just a few times more often than your colleagues. Getting interrupted over and over again, even if it's just once a week, over the course of a year and a half, that's going to cause someone to come back and say, no, I'm not going to contribute anymore. That's going to cause them to maybe not get a promotion that they should have gotten. And then over and over and over again, you see this. And suddenly you see companies that are run by people from very, very particular groups, when the company would be better off if everyone's ideas were equally valued and equally available at all levels of the company. Right? And we see that. We see that in many industries, not just in ours. So now we're going to talk about particular types of bias. And the best thing is we're also going to talk about things you can do walking out of this room to interrupt them. And my favorite part about this is the strategies to mitigate it are about 1,000 times easier than the problem. Nothing works that way. But what we're going to talk about first is something called performance bias. At its very core, performance bias is the fact that we are exceptionally poor at evaluating someone's skills because of the identity characteristics that they fall into. That's a little abstract. So here's an example. Has anyone heard of the Symphony study? Heard of this, the New York Symphony? Okay. It was kind of an accidental field experiment. So what happened is the New York Symphony got a new director and noticed that almost the entire symphony was male, which, on its face, if you're hiring the best person, is not a problem, if you want the best musicians. But this director said, that seems fishy to me, and changed the audition procedure, such that auditionees had to audition behind a screen, and they also asked women, not to wear high heels, things like that, so the clicking, right, is a gender cue. And then they started auditioning people for first chair positions for new joiners to the orchestra. And within a couple of years, the orchestra became almost 50% female. That's huge, right? And the problem was that they weren't able to actually discern who the best musicians were because they were culturally conditioned to believe that the male auditionees were the best. And you see this across all sorts of industries. So you see it in cooking. Cooking is considered a woman's domain when it's in the home, but if you think about all the elite chefs unless you're like me and you watch Top Chef really obsessively, right, you mostly think of male chefs. It's true in technology as well. There are tons of studies that show that this happens, especially for engineering roles. And you see a slight reversal in things like HR, where men are not stereotypically thought of as HR people, and so they can actually experience the same sort of performance bias as women in that. You see it with elementary teachers. Some people, they don't see men as elementary teachers, even though I think we would all agree that, young children having exposure to male and female role models at that age would actually be ideal. So the good news is there are things that you can do to help mitigate this. And again, we're not talking about going from 100% bias to 0%, but even dropping that bias by 10%, by 50% can have an incredible impact. So the first, always, when you're making a people decision, determine your objective evaluation criteria in advance. Our brains are exceptional at what we call post hoc justification. That means we make a biased choice and then our brain invents the logic for why that's a good idea. And there are studies that show that people do this. We're just really smart, totally by accident. So in a hiring scenario, this is actually pretty simple. If you say experience is more important than education, write that down. Write down all the candidates' experience in education. And when you go back, it's like a candidate scorecard, right? You say, oh, well, this person objectively had more experience at this skill. I am going to interview that person. I'm not going to use whatever criteria I want to, my brain wants to pick the person that I think I should pick. This works for performance reviews if you're a manager as well, or as a colleague, right? Have an idea of what success looks like and write it down. Keep yourself accountable to yourself. The second thing is use anonymization whenever you can, right? This doesn't work like working face-to-face, and I'm certainly not advocating like putting all your candidates behind a screen with a voice scrambler. That would be creepy, right? But things like work product tests are great for this. So someone is given a portfolio for a design role or a coding test that is graded with no names attached. So my personal research shows that when names are attached to coding exercises that are graded by individuals, women are 1/3 less successful at moving to the next interview stage when controlling for the quality of the code. So right, in tech we hear that if the code works, we'll hire you. It's not true. Don't ever believe anyone that says that. And it's because it's not true because our unconscious gets in the way, right? Our psychological biases prevent us from making the best decision. The cool thing is those effects disappear if you just pull someone's name off the exercise. It's like an easy fix, right? It seems too easy, but it works. It's really, really cool. Anonymization also works if you're going into a technical interview. You don't really need to know what's on the person's resume for an entry-level technical interview. Don't look at it. Just go in, ask your questions. Making sure you're asking a standard set of questions across all candidates. So you can both get signal across those candidates, and you can make sure that you're not asking particular candidates more questions or harder or easier questions. Because there's also studies that show that we tend to give easier questions to people that are like us in some way. Because we have an affinity for people like us. We want them to succeed. So the third thing, I usually call this the power of magical thinking, is prime your brain with counterexamples. A 2-second thought exercise where if I'm interviewing for a role in HR, say, because I'm on our HR team at Atlassian. And I think about a man and a woman, and I think about someone who's Latina or Latino like myself, someone who's white, someone who's black, someone who is South Asian. I thought about a bunch of different people that I know that work in HR. And instead of my brain relying on the idea that women are better at HR, or people from particular ethnic backgrounds are better at HR, I've rebuilt the model in my brain to say lots of different people are good at this position. So this is the cool thing, that you can pull processing from your unconscious to your conscious mind. My favorite example of this is everyone in the room think about the palms of your hands, just how they feel. You can kind of feel them now, but you probably couldn't before I told you to, right? So it's like magic. You can actually consciously process things if you think about it. This counterexample thing only lasts for a few hours to a couple of days, but that's certainly long enough to do an interview, right? It's a constant practice thing. All of our biases, all of our heuristics have been learned, and practice at this actually can change them. So we have a lot of power. The last thing you can do is get a second opinion. So by getting a second opinion, not only usually can someone point out illogic in what you're talking about, but also you can invoke anonymization, right? So go back to tick number 2. Don't say anything about the person's personal characteristics. Just give that second person the data and say, this is what the decision I'm thinking about making. And they'll point out whether that makes sense based on what you've told them. I personally have used this a ton. I've hired at least 2 people that I wasn't feeling like I should, and people talked me into hiring them, and I still say they were the 2 best hires I ever made. Like, they were just absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, I get in my own way all the time. And so I hope other people help me get out of my way too. The second thing, performance attribution bias. So this is a little bit different. But the idea with performance attribution bias is that we actually have trouble understanding how people became successful, what the driver of their success was. So for in-group members, we often attribute them being successful to their innate talent, their skill, their brilliance. Whereas out-group members, we tend to judge them or think they've been successful because they work hard, they're lucky, or they've received help. Right? And as a hiring manager or something like that, you always want the person who's innately brilliant, right? It has the effect for in-group members of judging them on their potential, and on out-group members or minority members of judging them on what they have already done. So what it does is it actually makes the bar significantly higher for minorities than it does for people from majority groups. So I think we've all heard the phrase, like, we don't want to lower the bar. The answer is you have already set the bar significantly higher. So yes, you do want to lower it because you want everyone to be at the same bar. That's really important to think about because what we want to do is get everyone on the same playing field. The way that I like to talk about this from a research point of view, there's a very well-known study that was done using psychology professors. And they sent out a bunch of identical CVs, and the only thing they changed was the first name. So they asked the reviewers, would you hire this person for an entry-level and assistant professor position? And the answer was yes. 79% of the time if the candidate was male. And when we flipped that name, only 49% of the time for women. Same qualifications, right? So this is performance bias. And then the next thing that happened was that when giving qualitative feedback, the reviewers actually asked more questions about the female candidate's qualifications. Questions that are absolutely reasonable in individual candidate cases. Things like, I couldn't make this decision without seeing her teaching evaluations, or I need proof that she got that grant on her own. But what happens is that we actually ask more of minority candidates than we do of majority group candidates, such that they have to provide more proof that they are capable of the opportunities that they are applying for, whether that be in a promotion cycle, whether it be in interviewing. This is a big deal. I mean, we talk about this. It's important. And all of my citations are at the bottom if you want to dig into the data. But there are things we can do to interrupt this performance attribution bias. This also affects more informal things, like when people put ideas forth in a meeting. right? Some people's ideas are gone along with more often, and I know there's probably a lot of people in this room, myself included, that have put forth an idea in a meeting and had it shut down only to hear it presented by a colleague 10 minutes later and adopted, right? This is the same kind of bias that affects that interaction. The first is simply good project management. Again, determine your measure of success, what it looks like, what types of contributions are valuable before you begin something, or at the beginning of the year if you're a manager for a team. So things like on a technical team, thinking about what mentorship looks like, in addition to things like technical contributions, in addition to things like office housework, setting up those lunches, sending out the calendar invites, cleaning up the room after the meeting, taking notes. Things like that are important. Because without being very specific about what those things are, we're more likely to give credit for team success to majority group members, regardless of the particular types of contributions that they have given. So again, take notes is my number one tip. Keep yourselves accountable to yourself. The second is keep track of individual contributions. Think about what those contributions look like and track them against what you've said is important, right? Because it helps you not to overweight a particular type of person's contribution. This is also really good for dealing with tensions between introverts and extroverts, right? Because they tend to give very different types of collaboration and things to their teams. And we all, I think, tend to have this extrovert bias at Atlassian, where it's like the people who speak up a lot, we try to make sure that they're not the only people getting credit, because often working quietly is also doing really amazing things. The third one, and this kind of goes for that interpersonal thing, is trace back your attributions and trace back the attributions of your colleagues. So thinking about what happens there. If you know that someone made a contribution that maybe isn't as obvious, speak up about it. Maybe it's you notice that someone put something forth in a meeting and someone else said it later and it was adopted. And you can say, oh, thank you, person A and person B. Those were great ideas. We're now on the right track. And you've suddenly completely interrupted it. It doesn't have to be a difficult thing, but if you've made sure that the correct attribution has been made. And you can imagine if this is happening to you, how great that is, that you're getting credit for your ideas. Because if that happens over and over again, you start to withdraw. You start to not be as engaged in your workplace, not bringing your ideas, and that hurts both you professionally and it hurts your team. The other thing, question your own emotional reactions when you're thinking about how someone was successful. I think, at least for me, I've consistently been in places where I've heard things like, oh, that person only got the job because they're a woman, right? I don't hear this at work, which is great. That's why I love my job. But I've heard this, or in colleges, we talk about affirmative action programs, right? And you hear, oh, that person only got in because they're black, or because they're Latina, or Latino, whatever it is, right? We hear this. And so thinking about where that assumption comes from, it's a fundamental error in understanding how we attribute success to people. It's actually funny that that's actually the opposite of what's true, right? Because we talked about the fact that the bar is actually much higher for minority group members. This is important. I usually tell people, whatever your emotional reaction is okay, but being aware of where these biases are affecting you can change how you behave. And over time, it'll change that emotional reaction, but viewing that reaction as valid is really important because it helps you recognize it when it happens. The third thing that we're going to talk about is the competence-likability trade-off. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. This is a particularly gendered phenomenon. And it comes from very, very different stereotypes and expectations we have about men and women's behavior. So at a very stereotypical level, we expect men to be more individualistic and self-promotional. We expect them to be more focused on their career. And women, the opposite. We expect them to be more concerned with group welfare, more focused on their family, more collaborative. And we also have expectations that women are nice. We have personality expectations of women that we don't have for men. And that's important because it means when men and women perform the same behaviors, they are judged very differently. So things like the word aggressive and assertive. Women are overwhelmingly called aggressive while men are called assertive for the same behaviors because we expect men to be self-promotional and to be forward and to be assertive. right? But when a woman is assertive, that is outside the bounds of our stereotype for their behavior, and so we code it as aggressive, right? The competence-likability trade-off in particular is a catch-22 for women. In order to be seen as competent in the workplace, they have to promote themselves. Maybe not in a braggart way, but in taking leadership on a project, in helping manage others getting their things done. That's how they're seen as competent. But when they do those things that are self-advocating, they are seen as unlikable because they are violating that expectation that they should be caring about the group. The trade-off is, if they choose to really focus on the group and not focus on their own advancement and their own self-promotion, they're seen as very likable, but they are also read as less competent in their role. Kind of have one, but not the other. And this is important because as a bystander, you have an incredible amount of power to interrupt this, and it's really easy. So thinking about this in terms of studies, I love research, if you can't tell, is a great study that was actually published by Fortune magazine looked at performance reviews of really, really high-performing individuals, so successful people, men and women. Managers were men and women. And one of the aspects that they looked at was the type of criticism that people received in those interviews, so constructive feedback. And there were two types of criticism. Skills criticism, something like you need to be better at JavaScript, or I need you to learn Workday, or personality criticism. So things like your style isn't good or your tone is a problem, right? So in this study, it turns out that 85% of women received personality criticism. Who wants to guess what percentage of men received personality criticism? 20, I heard? 19? 5. Ooh, that was really close. The answer is 2. Yeah, sorry, that's like the downer slide. Right? And this is important because what it means is that we are actually taught to judge men and women by very different criteria, right? Because I don't think the answer is that 85% of women have personality disorders. Like, that doesn't seem like the right inference to draw here. At least I don't think so. But this is important, right? Because that means that there can be more negative criticism or more things to criticize about certain types of people, or the way they are is the problem as opposed to the skills that they bring to the table. And that kind of gets unequally distributed. So again, the good news, here are things you can do. The first is push back on the penalty. This is really important. Again, recognizing your emotional response to something and then just mediating it. So this is something I personally, I see it a lot in myself. So things like, someone will ask me for something if I'm, getting something done at work and it's getting close to the deadline. And I'm like, ugh, please stop nagging me about that. And I do a check and I say, if this was a man checking in with me, would I be annoyed right now? And if the answer to that question is no, then I say, okay, yeah, I'm gonna respond to that person in the way I would, no matter who they were. So little tiny things, but it changes. I talk about this is something we talk about a lot at work, and we get all these feedback. Like, there was a woman on our support team who was talking about the fact that she'll write and rewrite emails 3 and 4 times because she doesn't want to come off as curt or stern. And a bunch of her male colleagues, we were just kind of having group chat, and they were all like, what are you talking about? Why would you do that? That's such a waste of time. And she's like, well, I have to, or people think I'm really mean and aggressive. And they're like, wow, that's weird. And someone pointed out to me that they started counting the number of exclamation points and smiley faces in my emails. And it's really embarrassing now because I can't stop seeing it. But it's true, I do it because in text, it's so easy to infer that someone is being really stern. And I personally, if you can't tell, I'm a little bubbly. I want to make sure that comes through when I'm writing because I'm really, really afraid of someone like the diversity lady being super scary. Right? That would be really bad. So it's something I fall into, but I'm also guilty of making these judgments. And that's the really important thing about this. It's not about one group being bad and doing something to another group. It's about something that all humans do that disproportionately and very consequentially affects specific groups. So your personal identity actually has less of a driver on this than you would expect. The second, advocate for your colleagues, right? So we know that women are punished more often for advocating for themselves, whether that's something informal, like taking leadership on a project, or something like negotiating for salary. So we know that women negotiate less, but one of the drivers of that is that they're more likely to face professional punishments for doing so. You can advocate for your colleagues. As a manager, maybe that's doing audits on your team to make sure compensation's fair, or maybe it's simply when one of your colleagues does something awesome, you say publicly, hey, thank you, that was really helpful. It don't have to be crazy world-changing things, but imagine the interruption there. If a woman, did something great and felt like she was going to be penalized for promoting it, but it really positively benefited you. I also like to call this say what you think, right? You should just do that with everyone. But it can disproportionately be positive for certain groups of people. And I think our engineering cultures, this one is actually really, really tricky because we tend to work with like a bunch of really brilliant people who we think know how awesome they are. And it is in my HR experience that that's actually not true, right? Because really smart people really often have imposter syndrome. And so they don't actually know they're awesome. And so just hearing like, thanks, that was awesome, it brings them from like a 2 to a 10 on how they feel about their competence. And that's true of everyone. But again, these things can disproportionately positively impact people from these groups. Watch for patterns in the way that you describe things. Words like pushy, abrasive, aggressive, difficult, bossy, right? How many men in the room have ever been called bossy? How many women in the room have ever been called bossy? Yeah? It's cool. Reclaim bossy. I think Beyonce tried to do that. But it's true, right? Even though the language doesn't appear gendered, it actually is. Or things like folks from minority groups are more often described as not a culture fit. Right? How many times have we heard, like, do I want to have a beer with this person? Do I have an intrinsic likable reaction to them? And so for people who our likability standards are higher for, are actually less likely to fit that sort of nebulous culture fit mold. And the way that we deal with that is we think really specifically about culture fit. So the other thing is set meeting ground rules. So things like no interruptions, because women are more likely to be interrupted than men. Just let's not have anybody interrupt. We have our head of design at Atlassian came up with this thing that he calls the facilitation chicken. So it's like this squeaky chicken that anytime you interrupt someone or you've been talking too long, someone in the room squeezes it. And so it's this like really funny, goofy way to just prevent behavior that you don't want, but it's not like some weird shaming device, which is nice, because we don't need to shame anyone. Or things like rotations of office housework, right? So women often are doing things like informal mentoring, setting up meetings, arranging lunch, sending out calendar invites, taking notes, cleaning up meeting rooms. Things like that that for the most part are probably not a part of their core job responsibilities and they're not compensated for it, but it takes their time and it takes their bandwidth. So simply assigning a rotation to that makes the entire playing field equitable. It makes everyone work together, but it also removes that expectation from the people who are most likely either to be asked to do it or to volunteer to do it because socially they're expected to do it, right? Really, really easy, tiny changes that you can bring back to your team and say, hey, if so-and-so is always taking notes, why don't we all do it? And I usually get the question, well, what if someone's really bad at taking notes? And I'm like, well, that's great. You have skills feedback for their performance review. We solved 2 problems. So yeah, competence likability is important. And the other aspect of this where this pops up is when you're talking about international relations, right? So the US and the West more generally is much more individualistic and self-promotional than people in Asian countries are. So they tend to be more sociocentric, which means that valuing group identity and group sort of adherence is more valuable to them. And so often when you're working with people across countries, you'll see that people from one country are seen as arrogant or too self-promotional, and the other people coming into that environment aren't self-promoting because that's not a value they have, but they have the risk of appearing less competent, even though they're not, right? So there are aspects of this that pop up outside of the gender issue, something to be thoughtful of, and something at Atlassian that we talk about a lot because we have offices in Sydney and Manila and Amsterdam and 2 offices in the US. So we kind of have a lot of cross-cultural stuff. And it's been really interesting to see how different communication styles and different professional styles start seeing these biases pop up and how we work through them. And I want to leave you sort of the talk part of this with two things. If you take nothing else, just check in with yourself. Bias tends to pop up when we're making people decisions, complex people decisions. And just a moment or two of mindfulness can actually help us interrupt them. Remembering the palm of your hand, that you can move this cognitive processing from your unconscious to your conscious and make the decision you intended to in the first place, really easy. This isn't crazy machinery. It's not anything too difficult. That's the first piece. The second piece is call others in. This works best if we talk about it and we're about it in the open, right? Let's say, hey, I'm human. I have some inefficiencies and I'm learning to deal with them. Will you help me? Right? You've suddenly made your workplace more inclusive. You've made it less biased. You've made it more meritocratic than it would have been otherwise, and it doesn't take a lot. That said, I say call each other in on purpose. So research shows that when we cause someone to feel shame, when they feel embarrassment about any of this stuff, they just don't learn it as well. They don't want to adhere to it. And so this is a face-to-face conversation. This is not, we say not in Confluence, that's sort of our wiki that we use for everything, right? This is about talking to people face-to-face and saying, hey, this is something I learned about bias, and I'm trying to make the best decisions I can, and I want you to help me, and I want you to help Indeed or Atlassian or Google or wherever you are. So that's really, really important. So that's all I have for you, but I love questions and I love chatting. So if anyone has questions, awesome.